You already know how this story ends. That's the problem. You've seen the photos, the Superdome, the rooftops, the water that wouldn't stop rising. You've heard the number, 1,800 people. You nodded, felt something heavy in your chest, and moved on with your day. But here's what nobody told you about Katrina. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't unstoppable. New Orleans had 12 hours, a full 12-hour window to get out before everything collapsed. And the people who didn't make it, most of them didn't miss that window because they couldn't leave. They missed it because they made the same decision you would have made. I need you to sit with that for a second, because this video isn't about what happened in New Orleans in 2005. It's about what's happening in your city right now. The same invisible countdown that nobody is talking about, the same window that exists in every major urban center, and the same decision that will separate the people who get out from the people who don't. My name is Atomic Capybara. I study how cities break, not the Hollywood version, not the dramatic collapse with explosions and chaos you can see coming from a mile away, the real version, the quiet version, the version where the signs were all there, where the window was open, and where the people who survived did one thing differently. Katrina is the most documented urban collapse in modern American history, which means it's the most useful. Every decision, every mistake, every survival success, recorded, analyzed, studied, and what those records show will change how you think about your city forever. Let's start at the beginning, not August 29th when the levees broke. Earlier, much earlier, August 26, 2005. 3 days before impact, the National Hurricane Center upgraded Katrina to a Category 3 storm. Meteorologists were watching a system that had already devastated South Florida. The models were converging. The projected path was becoming uncomfortably clear. At this point, New Orleans had roughly 72 hours. 72 hours. Most people wasted all of it. Most residents knew a storm was coming. Weather alerts were on every channel. The language was serious. Words like severe and critical appeared in official bulletins. This wasn't background noise. This was a direct warning delivered through every available communication channel simultaneously. And yet, the highways out of New Orleans were not yet jammed. Gas stations were open. Hotels in Baton Rouge, Houston, and Memphis had available rooms. The window was wide open. Here's the first thing Katrina teaches us about urban survival. The most challenging moment isn't when the crisis arrives, it's the 72 hours before, when leaving feels unnecessary. Human psychology has a name for this, normalcy bias. Your brain defaults to, things will probably be fine, not because evidence supports it, because they've always been fine before, because leaving feels dramatic, because your neighbors aren't leaving, because the refrigerator is full, and the storm is still just a shape on a weather map. This isn't weakness, this isn't stupidity, this is how human brains are wired, and it affected outcomes significantly in New Orleans. And that wiring, it's the same in you. August 27th. 48 hours before impact, Katrina upgraded to Category 4. Then, within hours, Category 5, maximum sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. The National Weather Service issued what would later be called one of the most stark official warnings in American meteorological history. Mayor Ray Nagin issued a mandatory evacuation order for New Orleans, the first in the city's history. The window was still open, but it was narrowing. Here's where the data gets painful. Studies conducted after Katrina found that many residents who stayed made that choice not because they had no warning, but because they had survived previous storms. They had ridden out Betsy in 1965, they had stayed for Georges in 1998. Each time, the warnings had felt similar. Each time, the storm had been survivable. Each time, staying had felt like the reasonable, experienced decision. Experience is a double-edged tool. Past crises build knowledge, but they also build templates. I've seen this before. I know how this goes. Katrina didn't fit the template. The people who survived were disproportionately the ones who treated it as something new, requiring a fresh decision, not a repeat. Ask yourself this right now, before we go any further. When was the last time you genuinely updated your mental model of what a crisis in your city could look like? Not based on what you've seen before, based on what's actually possible. August 28th, 19 hours before landfall. The window was closing fast. Interstate 10, I-55, and US 90, the main arteries out of New Orleans, began experiencing serious congestion. Louisiana activated contraflow operations, reversing inbound lanes on major highways to increase outbound capacity. But the people who had left on August 26th and 27th, they were already in Baton Rouge, already in Houston, already sitting in air-conditioned hotel rooms, TV on, Weather Channel, cold drinks from the mini fridge. Their hands weren't shaking, their gas tanks were full. Their families were safe beside them. The people leaving on August 28th were sitting in cars that weren't moving. Picture I-10 at noon, brake lights stretching to the horizon, engines idling, burning fuel going nowhere, the smell of exhaust mixing with August heat baking through windshields. Windows down, no AC saving gas. Kids crying in back seats, the radio crackling evacuation updates nobody can follow because the highway isn't moving. Robert left Sunday morning. Smart move, he thought. Beat the rush. 12 hours later, he's moved 8 miles. His gas gauge shows a quarter tank. The next station is 30 miles away. Cars all around him are turning off their engines. The highway has become a parking lot with no exit. 8 hours to go 20 miles. Some never cleared the city at all. Here's lesson 2. The escape window doesn't close gradually. It collapses suddenly. There's a threshold. When 500,000 people hit it simultaneously, the infrastructure that moves them efficiently becomes the thing that traps them. Roads designed for commuters can't handle mass evacuation. Gas stations can't supply an entire city at once. Your city has the same threshold. Every city does. The question isn't whether it exists, it's whether you know where it is. Before we talk about what survivors did differently, we need to understand what happened to those who stayed. The most important data from Katrina isn't the storm. It's the hours after, when 80% of the city was underwater, when the rescue system revealed its limits, and when those first 12 hours became the difference between difficult and overwhelming. That's in the next section. But before we get there, take 30 seconds right now. Seriously, open whatever map app is on your phone, look at your city, find the 3 main roads out, and ask yourself, if you needed to use all 3 simultaneously with 100,000 other people, which one would collapse first? You don't need to answer that question perfectly. You just need to be the person who's already asked it. Here's something the news coverage never showed you. The Superdome images went around the world. The rooftop rescues became iconic. The floodwater photos defined a generation's understanding of what crisis looks like. But there's a number that almost nobody talks about. In the areas of New Orleans that flooded most severely, post-disaster studies found that many people who didn't make it were found within a few blocks of their homes. They didn't get caught in the water trying to escape. They didn't get stranded on the highway. They were at home, in the place they felt safest, in the neighborhood they had lived in for decades, and the water came to them. Home felt safe. It wasn't. This is the third thing Katrina teaches us. Familiarity is not safety. The place that feels most secure is not necessarily the place that is most secure. And this lesson, this specific uncomfortable lesson, is the one that applies most directly to your city right now. August 29th, 6:10 a.m., landfall. Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 storm near Burris, Louisiana. The immediate wind damage was significant but survivable for most well-constructed buildings. People who had sheltered in place in solid structures felt the storm pass. Some looked outside afterward and thought, we made it. They were wrong. The real threat to New Orleans was never the wind. It was always the water. And the water didn't care that the storm had technically passed. The levee system, barriers separating a city below sea level from surrounding water, had been under discussion for decades. Engineers had raised concerns. Reports had been written. The vulnerability wasn't a secret. Every major city has a version of this. One critical infrastructure dependency, one system the entire city's safety rests upon. And in most cities, most residents have never thought about what happens when that system stops working. In New Orleans, it was flood barriers. In other cities, it's the power grid. In others, it's a single water treatment facility. In others, it's a highway bridge that carries 60% of evacuation traffic. The specific vulnerability is different. The principle is identical. Your city has a breaking point, one threshold, one system whose failure cascades into everything else. Do you know what yours is? 8:14 a.m., the 17th Street Canal levee broke. Water began pouring into the city. The water comes fast, brown, murky, smelling like gasoline and sewage mixed together. You hear it before you see it, rushing through streets, pushing cars aside like toys, cold, rising ankle deep, then knee deep in minutes. The sound, constant, relentless, water finding every opening, every weakness. By mid-morning, the lower 9th Ward, one of the lowest-lying areas of New Orleans, was experiencing flooding that moved faster than walking pace. Residents who had decided to shelter in place and wait out the storm now faced a situation that had transformed completely from the one they had prepared for. And in minutes, the city they knew disappeared underwater. Here's where survivor testimonies become the most valuable data we have, because the people who made it through the flooding in their homes, and many did, made specific, identifiable decisions in those first hours. They moved up immediately. Second floors, attics, rooftops. The ones who waited, who assumed the water would stop rising, who stayed on the ground floor monitoring the situation, many of them ran out of time. They found something that floats, doors taken off hinges, plastic containers, coolers, anything that provided buoyancy became a survival asset. The survivors weren't the ones with the best equipment. They were the ones who looked at what was around them and immediately asked, what in this room can keep me above water? They made noise, methodically and repeatedly. Colored fabric hung from windows, spray paint on rooftops, spelling help, anything that made them distinguishable from above. The rooftop is hot. August sun baking asphalt shingles. No shade. The smell of floodwater below. Thick chemical. Wrong. You wave fabric, your throat is dry, your hands shake from exhaustion, but you keep waving because that's what keeps you visible. That's what brings the helicopter. These aren't complicated techniques. They require no special training, no expensive gear, no advanced preparation beyond knowing they exist. But the people who used them had one thing in common. They had shifted mentally from waiting for the situation to improve to actively managing their survival. That shift, passive to active, from waiting to doing, kept more people in the survival window than any gear ever could. That mental shift is the most important survival skill that Katrina documented, and it's the one that no amount of stockpiling can replace. Let's talk about what was supposed to happen next, because this is the part that matters for anyone living in a modern city. Residents who stayed had made a calculation. The storm would pass, emergency services would respond, help would arrive. This isn't unreasonable. In normal circumstances, those systems work. In most crises, the infrastructure holds, the cavalry arrives, and people who sheltered in place are fine. Katrina wasn't normal circumstances. In a localized crisis, a house fire, a medical emergency, a car accident, the systems designed to help you will almost certainly reach you in time. This is what those systems are built for. This is what they do well. In a city-scale crisis, one where the emergency is happening simultaneously to hundreds of thousands of people, those same systems face a math problem they can't solve. Not enough rescue boats, not enough emergency personnel, not enough communication channels or supply trucks to serve an entire city simultaneously. The numbers don't work. They never will. The system doesn't break down because the people running it don't care. It breaks down because the numbers are impossible. Maria spent 3 days on her roof. She had 2 gallons of water, a bedsheet tied to the TV antenna, spray paint spelling help in letters 6 feet tall. When the helicopter finally came on day 3, she was severely dehydrated but alive. The family next door, who had waited on the ground floor expecting rescue within hours, didn't make it. The survivors in New Orleans who waited for rescue on rooftops, some for 3 days, some for 5. The ones who made it were the ones who had treated self-sufficiency not as a backup plan, but as the primary plan. They had water, they had visible signals, they had found elevated positions they could maintain, they had extended their own window long enough for help to eventually arrive. The question for your city isn't whether emergency services will respond to a major crisis. They will. The question is whether you can remain self-sufficient long enough for them to reach you, because in a city-scale event, that gap between crisis and rescue is measured not in minutes, but in days. Think about where you'd be during a crisis. Home, work, commute, pick one. Now ask if that location became inaccessible. Roads blocked, power out, water unavailable. How long could you function without outside help? 72 hours is the benchmark emergency agencies use. Most urban residents aren't close to 2 days of self-sufficiency in their current situation. That's not a moral failing. It's a design feature of modern urban life. Cities are built for efficiency, not redundancy. Every system is optimized for normal conditions. Your job, the only preparation task that actually matters, is to add the redundancy that your city didn't build in. We'll get to exactly what that looks like, because the survivors left a very specific blueprint, and it's simpler than any survival channel will ever admit. Let me tell you about two neighbors. Same street, same neighborhood, same storm, same flooding. One of them was rescued on day 2, uncomfortable, shaken, but alive and uninjured. The other was found on day 5 in conditions that emergency responders described as critical. Same crisis, 48 hours apart, and the difference between them had nothing to do with luck, nothing to do with money, and nothing to do with physical fitness. It had to do with a single decision made in the first hour after the levees broke. The first neighbor, the one rescued on day 2, had immediately moved everything useful to the second floor the moment water appeared under the front door. She moves fast, water touching her ankles, grabbing bottles from the fridge, cold, slippery with condensation, flashlight, phone charger, bed sheet. Her hands shake, but they don't stop. Upstairs, second floor, safe. She didn't have a survival kit. She didn't have emergency training. She had made one correct decision fast, and that decision bought her 48 hours. The second neighbor had waited. He watches the water. It's only ankle deep. It'll stop, he thinks. An hour later, it's knee deep. He moves for the stairs. Everything he needs is still downstairs. Underwater now. Not out of carelessness. Out of the same reasonable assumption that the water would stop. By the time the water proved him wrong, moving upstairs meant leaving behind everything he needed, and he arrived at his elevated position with nothing. Same window, same information. One person treated the first sign as the final warning, the other treated it as the beginning of a monitoring period. One decision, 48 hours of difference. That's how thin the margin is. This pattern, documented across dozens of Katrina survivor interviews, is the clearest behavioral signature of urban survival success. The survivors acted on early information as if it were late information. After Katrina, researchers from Louisiana State University, FEMA, and several independent disaster response organizations conducted extensive survivor interviews. They were looking for patterns. What they found was remarkably consistent. Not equipment, not money, not luck, just 5 behaviors. Behavior 1, vertical thinking. The moment conditions changed, survivors moved up. Every floor bought time. Height is the only currency that matters in flooding. The principle extends beyond floods. In any urban crisis, ask immediately, where is the highest ground available to me? Behavior 2, immediate resource concentration. They moved useful items to their position immediately. Water first, then signaling tools, then food. Priority mattered. The people who grabbed random items ended up with things that didn't help and none of the things that did. Behavior 3, signal creation before it felt necessary. They set up signals while conditions were manageable. Fabric on windows, marks on rooftops. By the time desperation hit, signals were already working. The people who waited until they felt desperate were often too exhausted to signal effectively. Behavior 4, rationing from hour 1, not from day 2, from the first hour. They treated every resource as if it needed to last twice as long. Help always took longer than expected. The people who had rationed from the beginning had margin when it mattered. Behavior 5, staying calm through action. They gave themselves a task, moving things, making signals, counting supplies. Any concrete action redirected panic into productivity. The task didn't need to be the most important thing. It needed to keep their hands moving and their mind focused while the situation stabilized. 5 behaviors. Any one of them could keep you in the survival window. All 5 together? They changed the odds completely. The residents had paid taxes for decades to fund the levee system. They had trusted, reasonably, that the systems would function. That trust wasn't honored, not from malice, from the gap between what infrastructure was designed to handle and what Katrina delivered. Here's the survival lesson inside that gap. Your city's emergency infrastructure isn't designed to protect you specifically. It's designed for the statistical average under average conditions. When the crisis exceeds the average, and the crises that matter always do, the protection you assumed you had disappears. Not partially, not gradually, completely and suddenly. The system has a limit. You need to know where that limit is before you hit it. This isn't an argument for distrust of government or emergency services. Those systems help people every day. This is simple simpler. Know the difference between what your city's systems can do and what they cannot do, and fill the gap yourself. The survivors who fared best weren't the ones who had abandoned trust in the system. They were the ones who had added personal capability on top of the system's capability, so that when the system hit its limit, they still had resources left. Every city has infrastructure residents trust without examining: water treatment, power grid, bridges carrying evacuation routes, communication towers, hospital capacity. Most urban residents have never asked what happens to my neighborhood if this system fails. Not the city in general. My neighborhood, my block, my building. That answer, and it's a question with a real findable answer, tells you exactly where your city's levee is, and it tells you how much time you would have if it broke. Higher elevation neighborhoods, Uptown, Garden District, experienced a different crisis than the lower 9th Ward. Same storm, radically different outcomes. One geographic variable, publicly available information for decades. Your city has the same variation. Some areas are more vulnerable than others. This information exists. It's in city planning documents, in FEMA flood maps, in utility company service records. The people who found it before they needed it were the ones with options when the window opened. We're almost at the part where everything comes together, because everything we've covered, the 12-hour window, the levee dependency, the 5 survivor behaviors, the gap between system capacity and individual need, it all points to the same conclusion. And it's not the conclusion most survival channels will give you. It doesn't require a bunker. It doesn't require a $3,000 kit. It doesn't require leaving your city or changing your life. It requires knowing 3 specific things about where you live, and doing 2 specific things before you need them. That's in the final section. Here's what the survivors of Katrina actually had in common. Not gear, not money, not special training. They knew 3 things about where they lived, and they had done 2 things before the storm arrived. That's it. That's the entire blueprint. Everything else, the stories, the data, the behavioral patterns, leads here. 1. Your elevation, not your city's elevation, your specific location's elevation. A real number you can find in 3 minutes using FEMA's free flood map service. Type in your address, find out where you stand, literally. The residents who survived in place were on higher ground, not dramatically higher. Sometimes 4 or 5 feet made the difference between manageable and overwhelming. In other crisis types, power outages, civil unrest, supply chain disruption, elevation translates to visibility, to defensibility, to options. Know your number. 2. Your single infrastructure dependency. What is the one system whose failure would most directly affect your specific location? For some neighborhoods, it's the power grid. For others, it's a single access road. For others, it's a water treatment facility. This is findable information. City utility maps, local emergency management websites, even neighborhood association records often contain this data. Once you know it, you know your city's version of the levee. You know what to watch. You know what early warning looks like before it becomes obvious to everyone else. One system, one failure point. Know yours. 3. Your realistic exit window. Not the theoretical evacuation route the city has published. The actual window, the point at which your primary exit route becomes unusable under mass evacuation conditions. This requires nothing more than looking at your main exit roads and asking, how long does this route take normally? And how long would it take if every vehicle in a 2-mile radius was using it simultaneously? The answer tells you when you need to leave, not when the official order comes. When you need to leave before the window closes. 1. Build 72 hours of independence into your current location. Not a bunker, not a year of supplies. 72 hours, water for 3 days, food requiring no refrigeration or cooking, a light source independent of the grid, a battery-powered radio that functions when your phone network is down. This is the baseline, the minimum that transforms you from someone needing rescue in the first 72 hours into someone who can wait calmly, with resources, with options for the situation to develop. 2. Have a decided trigger, not a vague intention to leave if things get bad. A specific pre-decided condition that, when it occurs, means you leave immediately, without debate. The people who evacuated New Orleans successfully on August 26th and 27th had made this decision before the storm arrived. They had said to themselves, to their families, if the forecast reaches Category 4 and the track holds, we leave that day. They didn't wait for the mandatory order. They didn't wait to see what their neighbors did. They had a trigger, and when the trigger was met, they moved. Picture yourself making that decision now, coffee in hand, calm afternoon, no sirens, no chaos. You write it down, category 4 plus track confirmed equals we leave. Simple, clear, binary. The paper sits in a drawer. You don't think about it again until the day you need it. And on that day, there's no debate, no second guessing. The trigger is met, you move. Your trigger should be specific enough that you can't rationalize around it. Not if things look serious, because things will always be ambiguous enough to rationalize staying. A number, a category, an official action, a specific visible condition in your neighborhood. Something binary that removes the decision from the moment of crisis and places it here now when you're calm and thinking clearly. Make the decision now, before the window opens. New Orleans was a city of 500,000 who believed the system would protect them. They were reasonable to believe it. The system had protected them before. It failed because the crisis exceeded normal conditions, and the gap between what the system could handle and what actually arrived changed the lives of 1,800 people permanently. Your city is not New Orleans. Your crisis will not be Katrina. The specific threat, the specific infrastructure failure, the specific window, all of it will be different, but the structure will be the same. A window that opens quietly, a threshold that collapses suddenly, a gap between what the system can do and what the situation demands, and a set of decisions made either before the crisis or scrambled together during it that determine which side of that gap you end up on. The 12-hour window existed. Most people used 0 of it. You now know why. You now know what the people who used it did differently. And you now know the 3 things to learn and the 2 things to do before your city's version of that window opens. This is what urban survival actually looks like. Not gear, not bunkers, not fear. Information, decision, action in that order before you need them. Before you close this video, do one thing. Open FEMA's flood map right now. Type in your address, find your elevation. That's step 1. It takes 90 seconds. Do it now while you're thinking about it. Because the moment you need this information, you won't have time to look for it. If this changed how you think about the city you live in, share it with one person who lives there too. Because the window, when it opens, doesn't open just for you.